Hello, it's the 24th of July. This is Renew Every Morning, and I'm Paul Anderson-Walsh, and delighted that you're with me today. So thank you, as always, for taking the time. Well, we are very much in the grip of our series about postcards of grace, and today I have a character for you that I think you're going to enjoy. You'll know her well. You don't know her by name because we're not told what her name is, but you'll know her story, I'm pretty sure. She's known as the Widow of Zarephath, and we meet her in 1 Kings. She's the lady we're going to call the one who baked in hope. Well, there's an interesting preamble to this story as we see in 1 Kings, and the preamble is essentially this. What do you do when the brook dries up? Now, you'll know this story is connected with the widow and the great prophet Elijah, and these two come into contact into a really interesting way. Now, Elijah's a fugitive, and he had been caught up in his own miracle, the brook miracle. And you know what happened. The brook, he sat by the brook, the ravens came and fed him. But there came a moment when the ravine where he was hidden, which he was hidden away from the wrath of Ahab and Jezebel, you remember, there was a drought, and it stricken the land. And it was very interesting because what it wants to signal to us as we begin this new chapter in Elijah's life, although it's not Elijah we're interested in, it's the widow in particular, is that whereas day by day by day the ravens came, these kind of agents of grace to provide for him, these delivering hands, if you like, delivering bread and meat to the prophets, what's important to notice here is that sometimes in your life the brook dries up. And the thing about us is that we get very familiar with the way of God providing. And if God is always the source, and here's what I want us to hear, but sometimes he changes the supply. He's always the source, but sometimes he changes the supply. And if you've got a brook mindset and a raven mindset, when the brook dries up and the raven stops coming, you're going to begin to wonder what's happening. But what happens is the brook dries up not because God has forgotten us, but because God's moving us. And this is a principle that we see time and time again, particularly in the page of the Old Testament, where the cloud moves. So people don't get to settle, the cloud moves. So the source is constant, but the supply might shift. So maybe you need to hear that today. The source is constant, but the supply might shift. God never runs out, he only reroutes. So just hold on to that, would you? What sustains you in one season may not be the thing that sustains you in the next season. That might not be the thing God chooses to carry you. What looked like an end might actually be a beginning. But again, just watch this. And here we see, this is really interesting because this particular drought puts him in the path of the widow of Zarephath. And maybe there is a moment where each of us need to come to our own Zarephath. And Zarephath, by the way, means the place of smelting, the place of refining, the place where perhaps miracle provision is hidden right in plain sight. So God sends Elijah, the great prophet, not to a palace, but to a widow, not to abundance, but to empty jars. And literally when he arrives, his brook has run dry, but so is hers. And there's a really profound question, which is essentially this. When you think about the thought of this movement away from the provision he's got, and the movement to a woman who's got nothing and no ability to provide, we see some profound things, I think. One is that God's power to demonstrate his love and his provision in unlikely places. God sends Elijah outside of Israel to a Gentile woman in a Phoenician, there's modern-day Lebanon, near Sidon, right on the cusp of Jezebel's territory, right by near her palaces. And this kind of bold move shows that kind of God's grace isn't confined to Israel, which of course we already know. And grace can appear where you least expect to find it. And that's something we need to hold on to. By the way, Jesus references this in Luke's Gospel. He says, there are many widows in Israel, it says. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to the widow of Zarephath. Now, that really upset his audience, but that's because God demonstrates his impartial mercy. It's not one of the Jewish widows that God draws into this story. It's one of the widows from the outcasts that he wants to draw into this story. One of those from the enemy. So, number one, there is the first thing we got to understand is that God demonstrates his power in unlikely places and with unlikely people. The second thing is that God wanted to provide for both Elijah and the widow. This was a mutual provision. Elijah needed the food, and the widow, my goodness me, she was in need of a hope and of a miracle. But by obeying God's word, what happened? He is sustained by God's economy. The one, essentially, who gives faith receives more than he gave. That's the point. And provision flows through obedience, not through abundance. That's how it works. Now, the other thing we might learn from this story is that it was designed to refine Elijah and the widow, because Elijah's still got more learning to do. Remember I told you, Zarephath means smelting place. That's a kind of the place of refinement through fire. And Elijah is being refined to trust, and he is being taught humility through living in the home of a foreign widow. He doesn't even give a name to, by the way. Bear that in mind. And the widow herself is being refined by faith. She has her last morsel of food, and she gives it away on the word of a stranger. Now, I guess the question is this. God could have chosen anybody he wanted to. But why did he choose these two people in desperate situations? Sometimes we find that we get too emotionally bankrupt, people finding if they come together they might be able to finance each other. But this is not that. This is a completely different order at all. This is grace working in relationship. And there's a lovely foreshadowing of the gospel here, because the story prefigures Jesus. A prophet brings good news to a foreign woman. The poor and the marginalized are honored and with God's presence. And that's kind of where life emerges and kind of just springs up from death. And here's what the prophet says: the jar will not run dry. And maybe you need to hear that today. Maybe that's something you need to recognize, that your jar will never run dry. So God sends Elijah out to break all kinds of taboos. Religious and social boundaries have to come off, and to show the kingdom of God in all its glorious nature. So let's see. So God sent Elijah to the widow to show, one, that the source never runs out, even when the supply shifts. Two, because God's miracles are often hidden in the most humble places you can possibly imagine. Three, obedience opens the door to mutual blessing. And four, faith is refined in the furnace of scarcity. And five, grace always flows in the margins. Now here is the conversation. Here's the response to the woman, the widow, gives when she's just beginning to learn love on the job. As surely as the Lord lives, she replied, I don't have any bread to give you, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. That's all I've got. She's got no name, just a title, widow. Her place, Zarephath, the smelting place, and her condition, bankrupt, empty. Yet the prophet lived in her house and ate at her table, and grieved with her, and watched her child die, and saw that child be raised again. He must have known her name. Obviously he must have known her name, but we're not told it. Why? Well, because perhaps too often, and these stories tell us this, the world identifies us by our suffering rather than our story, our suffering rather than our stigma, rather than our true identity. And she's not called by who she is, she's just called by what she's lost. She's the widow. And you want to know, she's just lost, she's in deficit. But God knew her name, and even though God knows her name, he knew her, but chose not to name her. Isaiah reminded us of this. Isaiah said, see, I have engraved your name on the palm of my hands. Let me tell you, the widow had a name, but it's not anything we need to know. Except this, the world forgets your name, but God will never forget you. The woman's not from Israel, as I've said. She's a Gentile from the land of Jezebel, the arch enemy. And yet that's exactly where Elijah is sent to. And it's wonderful because Israel in this story had become a land of famine and also a land of apostate. It was a land of faithfulness as well. Had no food and had no faith. But in Sidon, the land of the supposed enemy, is where Elijah finds his refuge. He finds his home and brings someone to faith. And the psalmist tells us, you prepare a table for us in the presence of our enemies. And here, in the shadows of Jezebel's homeland, God lays a table at the hands of this widow. She's gathering sticks, she doesn't build like this is because she's about to prepare her last supper. And remember how prophetic this is. This is her Last Supper. But the Last Supper is a prelude to the resurrection, the cross and resurrection. And this is going to be hers. She's at the end. She has no food. She has no options. She has no hope. This is her Last Supper. And in her despair, in walks a prophet and makes the most ridiculous request. Make me something first. What the heck? Now, there's something in this request that sparks something in this woman. Because it wasn't a tone of selfishness. It wasn't a tone of, I don't care, you've got nothing to eat, give me something to eat. This is a test of surrender, a chance to rise by faith. And she seizes it, she hears it, she says, yes. How does that make any sense? There's nothing in the house except this Last Supper meal. But she spies something. She spies death and resurrection. And she sees Elijah as a type of Christ figure. And so even though her poor stomach is growling and her stunned stomach is swelling and for emptiness, she just says yes. Oh my goodness. And that becomes the womb of an incredible miracle. Day by day, by day, by day, the flour doesn't run out. The oil never fails. Scarcity literally is turned into an eternal supply. Now, this isn't the prosperity gospel, don't get that. This is the provision gospel. This is about telling us that God didn't give us riches, he gave us sufficiency. My grace is sufficient for you. Sufficient to live, enough to stay, and enough to believe. And so today's grace note, if you like, is really quite simple. There are always days when all you have left is not enough. Or it doesn't seem like it's enough. But remember, we saw this. This is what the Syrophoenician woman said when we studied this a couple of weeks ago. Even the crumbs, just a crumb of the bread of life is enough to spring everything back to life. She has a handful of courage, she has a handful of faith, and she has a handful of flour. And by God's economy, she has all that she needs. The Widow of Zarephath shows us something profound. You don't need to be a name to be known. You don't need plenty to be generous. And you don't need certainty to say yes. You just need to believe that God is still in the jar. Because even with a little, God can be just too much. So that is learning love on the job. And just think about what she saw. That Last Supper turned in one glorious scene to be a death, a resurrection, and an ascension. May you be blessed and may you learn what it is to live on the provision of God. God bless you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.